The All-American Dream Reconsidered Conference. I am not President Ali Malekzadeh. I am Mike Malley, the Provost and Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs. Our President had an unexpected family emergency, so you get me. So we begin today by acknowledging that the land we gather on is the traditional, unceded territory of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. We honor with gratitude this land and the indigenous people. Roosevelt University alumnus and former chairman of the board, Maurice Smith, for his ongoing service and support, the leadership of Maurice, and the financial support from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois makes this conference possible. The American Dream Reconsidered Conference started as a vision that Ali had shortly after he became president, and it is now in the 10th year, thanks to the generous support of Blue Cross Blue Shield. Today's panel focuses on a critical issue at the heart of our political life, the current state of democracy, American democracy, along with the future of the Democratic Party. At the time when our nation is increasingly divided politically, economically, and socially, these questions are more urgent than ever. We are honored to be joined by Malcolm Kenyatta, a powerful voice for progressive change and a rising, here he is, leader within the Democratic Party. Mr. Kenyatta has been at the forefront of efforts to build a more inclusive, representative, and grassroots-driven political movement, one that meets this moment with bold ideas and renewed purpose. I'm very excited to hear his vision for the path forward. I want to thank Professor David Faris for moderating today's panel. He is a professor of political science at Roosevelt University, and he's the author of 2 books, It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics, and The Kids Are All Left, How Young Voters Will Unite America. Professor Faris writes for a number of national publications, and he is a frequent commenter on contemporary politics. And so, without further ado, I will turn things over to Professor Faris.
Thank you, Mike, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to everybody for courageously fighting through the insurrection on the war-ravaged streets of Chicago. We're really, really grateful to be joined today by Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, who is a third-generation North Philadelphia native and a legislator currently serving in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. I'm going to condense this bio in the interest of time, but it is very, very impressive. So
you can condense, but also embellish, okay? Add some stuff in there.
I'll see what I can do. In 2023, he was appointed by President Joe Biden to chair the Presidential Advisory Commission on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Black Americans. And in February 2025, he was elected as vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. And we're here today to chat about all the boring and uninteresting things that are happening in our country right now. So please join me in welcoming Representative Kenyatta. The audience, and then we will conclude at 12:15. So I'm just gonna hop right to it, if that's all right with you. Okay. So research suggests that younger Americans, while they did not actually make a sharp turn to the right, as some people are claiming in 2024, are a little bit disillusioned with the Democratic Party and could have long-lasting consequences right now.
So first of all, good morning. Okay, good. I grew up in a black church. I got to hear somebody say something to know I'm in the right place. So I just want to say I'm happy to be with you all this morning. And to your point, there was much less insurrection than I was promised. I was promised cars on fire. I was promised a lot from the jagoff in the White House. And a lot of that was not present when I got here. But let me say this. Let me start with this point. When I ran to be vice chair of this party, like all of you, I was there in November, had an election. Outcome, from my perspective, was not great. And there are a couple of different things that you can do in moments when you feel a lot of frustration. You can take the covers, throw them over your head, and depending on like the quality of the covers you got, that might be a nice place to be, okay? Or you can decide that getting engaged doesn't require you to be frustration-free. My running to be vice chair of the party was not a pat on the back of everything that the party has ever done. It was a recognition that systems do not change from the outside. They just don't. There is a great thinker for whom I never had the pleasure of meeting. He died in a tragic plane crash, but I think a lot of what we talk about as progressive politics, I think you can draw a line back to a senator from Minnesota by the name of Paul Wellstone. And Paul Wellstone and his view of progressive change, I think a lot of leaders who you know and may be inspired by, whether knowingly or not, can draw a line back to their policies and their view of the world back to Paul Wellstone as well. And Paul would say one of the things, Senator Wellstone would say one of the things that I just said, that you do not change systems from the outside. And in fact, it should be your frustration, your impatience, that should drive you to get more involved, not drive you to be less involved, frankly. I will say this because I'm sure it's one of the things people are thinking about. One of the questions I get asked often of Malcolm, how did you get involved in politics? You got involved so young, on and on and on. My political origin story is very, very simple. I was poor. I was pissed off about it. I wanted to see the manager. I wanted to understand how the hell I got the trials and tribulation package when I had not signed up for that. And I wanted to know what the hell was happening in my name, in all of our names. People go to beautiful, ornate rooms like this and make a bunch of decisions on our behalf and usually don't know a damn thing about what's happening in our lives. They don't. And so we can either say, these rooms weren't built for us, and these rooms don't care about us, and all of those things are true. But stopping there, waving the white flag, and saying that we are going to allow the 400 billionaires that right now have 50% combined, 400 people have 50% of the combined wealth of the other 50% of the American people. We can say that's fine. Or, I don't think it is. Or we can say, what can we do? And what is every single tool that we can put at our disposal to change that system that is so top-heavy and that does not position all of us to be in a community where we can have a good, solid life? And I think that for me, is what is at the core of what we should be doing, what we must do to build connection, to push back as well as build up, to yes, push back on an administration that is out of control, to push back against an intransigence that has left too many just sort of watching everything happen without an aggressive response. But we also have to build up the institutions that will give us the fighting chance to actually make the change that we need. And I think we absolutely need a strong Democratic Party in this moment. But a strong Democratic Party is only as strong as the people who are in it. The Democratic Party is not the 9 people who got elected to leadership. If it's just the 9 of us, then we might as well pack it up. It's millions and millions of Americans, including 70+ million Americans who did not vote for ICE agents propelling out of Black Hawk helicopters, who did not vote for our neighbors to be rounded up by masked men, who did not vote for the level of corruption and incompetence that we see on the daily basis. And so we should not position ourselves as if all hope is lost because we lost a consequential election. We did. But there's nothing for us in this moment back in November. We can't do anything about what happened in November, as painful as that is. Everything that we can control is in front of us, and that's where I tend to spend a lot of my time and focus.
Thank you. I think we should listen to you, given that you're like 700 years younger than the Democratic Party leadership, so that's great. Looking forward, right, in 2024, Democrats lost a lot of ground with Black and Latino voters. According to the gold standard Pew validated voter analysis that came out over the summer, Trump won 15% of Black voters which would be the best showing for Harris, only won these voters by 3 points, which would be the best Republican performance that we've ever recorded since we started collecting this data. As you said, 2024 is in the past, it happened. But moving forward, how do Democrats get those voters back?
So let's hold two thoughts at once, because you're asking a critical question about how do we continue to engage core parts of the Democratic constituency. And that's an important question that I'm going to make sure I answer in detail. But let me also push back a little bit on this narrative that Black and Latino voters are somehow responsible for what's happening in this moment. If they had just voted enough, if Black folks had just not, voted at 15%, we should be very clear that Black folks, Asian voters, Hispanic voters, young voters overwhelmingly voted against what is happening right now in this moment. And I think we spend a lot of time asking, how do Democrats get 100% of these groups, as opposed to spending more time asking, how do we continue to have conversations, frankly, with a lot of white people in our country who voted for this administration, a majority of whom have voted for the Republican candidate since the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And so we need to have a tougher conversation, because Black and Hispanic voters in this country are still not a majority of the population. And we need to figure out, how do we get a majority of the population, not necessarily just voting for the Democratic candidate, and I want people to vote for the Democratic candidate, obviously, but having a conversation about what it means to really be neighbors, what it means to have a multi-racial, multi-generational, multi-ethnic democracy in country. And I think a lot of the frustration you see from voters that have been core Democratic constituencies, at least in the modern era, is a broader frustration with the system and how the system works. A system that I mentioned, we are renegotiating in real time, how it should work, if it should work, and who it should work for. And I think the unfortunate truth is that Republicans have been consistently, it's the day after Sunday, so I'm trying to be very nice here, consistently on the wrong side of very important issues. Is that good? All right, that's nice. And I think that oftentimes people don't see Democrats moving at the speed of the need. But we also need to be very clear that in a democracy that is, by its very nature, our government is set up to be adversarial, right? Unlike what's happening right now, the Supreme Court's job is to not just say yes. Unlike what you see happening right now, the legislature not actually stamping anything that this president is doing. And so when the system actually operates the way our founders intended, you have an adversarial system. But when you have people within those systems, But when you have people within those systems that are also adversarial, on top of a system that is naturally adversarial, it puts you in a really difficult position if you want to build something. If you want to be in a position of just tearing stuff up, just blowing things up, making government work less, you have a really easy job. And saying government doesn't work. And then they get up every single day, put on their shoes, and say, how can I make it not work more? And when you're a Democrat and you're somebody who wants the system to work, you have a really complicated job. You have a job of saying, my engagement is not a blessing of everything that's wrong with the system, but also we need a system. And in the last election, where a lot of people were frustrated with a system that I think Republicans are not solely responsible, but arguably more responsible for making ineffective. When Democrats say we want to protect democracy and we want to protect systems, people hear that as a co-signing of how the systems are functioning now. And when you're saying government doesn't work, everything's rigged, things are rigged, but they weren't rigged in the way he was saying. And the problem is that we have a really complicated job of acknowledging the brokenness of the system while also acknowledging that democracy, with all of its warts, is the best form of government that we got, and certainly it is superior to a government run by a guy that wants to be a dictator, who believes that we should all be waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, seeing what the hell he decided to tweet that day, and then orienting our lives around his fever dreams. Now, is a system where 5 or 6 people in the Senate can hold up a living wage for millions of Americans? Is that system good too? No, that's not good either. And so I just think that Democrats have a really tough job in this moment. And I think a part of the way we sort of move forward is to, A, have a clearer sense in the mind's eye of voters of what we believe and what we stand for. And I think a part of the way you do that is by having messengers that can really effectively communicate that. And I think the messengers that can best communicate that are the people for whom the issues we're debating are not hypothetical. I think a part of the reason we need more young people in this moment is not simply because we need younger bodies to reinforce a system that is crap. Because I don't want young people who don't have a different vision of how we need to govern. I don't think that's what anybody's calling for either. But a part of the reason I think young people have been so effective in this moment in communicating what Democrats stand for and what our future should be is because these issues are not hypothetical for us. We are literally fighting for in this moment whether or not we're going to be able to live on a damn planet where we can have such luxuries as being able to drink the water and breathe the air. That's not like a hypothetical thing. We are living in a world where the median age to buy a home now is in your mid to late 50s, when it was in your mid to late 30s just 20 years ago. And so we're in a position where, are we ever going to be able to buy a house? Like, literally, am I ever going to be able to start a family with any level of stability and certainty? And so you need people who can go out and effectively communicate the urgency of this moment while also not advocating for an authoritarian form of government that, in many respects, can be quicker than a system where we debate and there's deliberation and all these different things. Certainly having one guy on Twitter decide, that's quicker. It doesn't make it better. And so we have to have people who speak with urgency, but who also speak with urgency about defending the systems that allow us to disagree in a way that does not encourage political violence, and to disagree in a way that does not concentrate power in the hands of a few select group of people.
Great. Thank you for that. I want to follow up on something you said about sort of like being committed to what we believe and communicating that to people. So I guess as part of your role in the DNC, like, what do you see and what can the party do to arrive at a set of like agreed upon principles, right? I mean, I think there's the media vision of what divides Democrats from one another. You know, it's the progressives versus the moderates, and then it seems like a new fault line in the party between those who are asking for a more publicly confrontational politics with the Trump administration and those who want to take like James Carville's advice to like play possum and let the Republicans, you know, hang themselves with their terrible policies, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is like, it's one thing to call for this vision. I was hoping you could share with our audience here, like what you see both inside and outside the party. How do you see that happening, and what do you think that vision should be? Like, what's a winning vision for us?
So I do think the fault line that you outlined is the real fault line in this party, in this moment. It's a fault line between the fighters and the folders. People who believe that we should fight like hell for a version of this country where every single person can not just survive, hang on by your fingernails, but can actually thrive. And people who think we should roll over, play dead, and hope that I think we have a pretty simple, every tool at our disposal, and whether or not we're willing to reject. We've heard for too long, oh, but we can't do this because the filibuster. Well, get rid of the filibuster, which allows a small majority of people to stop progress on all of the things that we need. There have been people who says, well, the Supreme Court, said die on the bench, but actually has the types of roadblocks and buffers that we have at every other Supreme Court. In Pennsylvania, you can't be on the Supreme Court after the age of 75. That's the type of idea that we might consider for the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, there's no other Supreme Court like these niceties should be preserved. I think we should preserve the ability for people in this country to live their damn lives. I think that's what we should preserve. Not preserve this faux collegiality that has not served us well. I'm all for being, polite, but when somebody kicks you in the... I think back about what Republicans did with Merrick Garland, not seating him on the Supreme Court. I think back to them keeping the Senate open so Joe Biden could not get recess appointments. And I think there are a number of occasions where, in retrospect, the previous administration and future administrations need to be ruthless in the pursuit of making people's lives better. If the Supreme Court can say that we can now effectively racially profile American citizens, but yet we can't cancel student loan debt, I don't know, I would just cancel the damn debt, take me to court, and we'll just stay in court until it's over. But at that point, the debt will be canceled, okay? Like, that's where I'm at with that. And I think that that's true in a variety of different areas. I think that people want to see us protecting the ability for people to have a good life, not protecting a civility that frankly no longer exists. You can't be civil in a vacuum. And I think that they are making it very clear. They have no respect for the rule of law. They have no respect for us in many ways. And what we have to have is a respect for the American people. And a way you show respect for people is that you do things that make their lives better. The filibuster, court reform, having candidates who can speak authoritatively and affirmatively and passionately about the future that we need. I think those are all the things that we need to accomplish to actually move the party forward. But then also, we have to have a tough conversation with people who are frustrated, a tough conversation within our movement for people who are anxious about change. Nobody wants to join a pity party. Hear me on this. Any of you who have ever been to a party and a promoter has invited you, do you want to go to a party where somebody stands outside the club and says, well, you know what, the drinks inside are watered down, all the lights are on, full lights, okay? The DJ is doing it from his iPhone off of his little Bluetooth speaker, and nobody's dancing, please come in. Like, who the hell wants to be a part of that? Nobody. And so I think a part of the way that we actually get people re-engaged in the Democratic Party is to also be a little bit prouder to be Democrats. I've said I'm not going to spend 4 years somehow apologizing for being a Democrat. And a part of how we get our mojo back is by helping the American people understand actually who the hell we are. You've written about this, and maybe in your research you've seen this. FDR remains like one of the most popular presidents in people's imagination, because of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all the things that came after the Great Depression, not just in his presidency, but in the era after that. But a majority of the American people can't tell you FDR was a Democrat. So there are things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, CHIP, food stamps, which Democrats defend, but people don't even know it was a Democratic idea to begin with. There is not a thing in the modern social safety net that was not built by the Democratic Party, and we ought to have some steel in our spine about that. Obamacare, when it first happened, was a very unpopular program, but it's the second most popular program in American history. We ought to have some steel in our spine about that. And then we have to talk about what we want to do next. And I talked about some of the structural things that we can do next, but you have to start from a place of confidence. And I think, if nothing else, Donald Trump has completely unwarranted, but he has confidence. He goes out and consistently takes credit for things that Democrats do. And I think one of the worst things I saw from a polling perspective that sort of highlighted this failure of confidence was in the 2024 election. I hope everybody in this room knows what I'm about to say, but if you don't, you would be right in line with the polling that I saw. Joe Biden signed legislation passed by only Democrats that capped the cost of insulin at $35. You all know that Democrats did that, Joe Biden did that. You know that? I'm seeing most people shake their heads, but there's some people who are not shaking their heads. There was polling that I saw right before the election where a majority of the American people did not know Democrats had done that. And it was literally the most popular policy that we were discussing, and they didn't know it was the Democrats' policy. Donald Trump saw those polls, I'm sure, and he spent the last 3 months of the campaign saying that he had capped insulin at $35. And so I think we have this issue where if we haven't solved every problem, if we haven't accomplished everything we want to accomplish, then we can't take a victory lap, we can't celebrate the things that we've done. But you only invite more people into a celebration, right? You don't want to go to that crappy party, but if you've seen a block party and people outside cutting up, you want to go see what was happening. And I think that we have to be in a position where we have a little bit more confidence as well as a lot of self-reflection. And I think the press, the political establishment has trapped the Democratic Party into constantly kicking ourselves in the face. We are not going to masochist ourselves to a majority in this country. We have problems, but we don't have problems like the Republicans have problems. We're not a part of a damn cult. And we ought to be a little bit braver and a little bit more incredulous about protecting the things that we have done and about celebrating the things that we've accomplished on behalf of the American people, and then be really aggressive about what we're going to accomplish for the American people next.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a lot for us to think about. And some of what you were saying sounds like, let's use the power that we have, right? But in some ways that's a problem for future Democrats, right? And right now Democrats are dealing with this siege on all fronts. I don't want to speak for everyone in the room, but I think there's a lot of fear and nervousness and trepidation about what's happening in our city here at the hands of the federal government and other cities like it, and what's in store for the next year before we have these midterm elections. And so I guess, at the No Kings rally on Saturday, the mayor of Chicago called for a national general strike. And I think that people, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to endorse that or not endorse that, but I think that people are really looking for guidance from the leadership about look, man, we can't wait another year to put a stop to some of this stuff. What can we do right now? What can the governor do? What can the mayor do? And then more importantly, what can we all do to stop some of this stuff in its tracks before it's too late, honestly?
So I'm going to say two things that sort of sound at odds with each other, and they're really not. So every day, let me say it this way. Every day I wake up and I try to make a list in my head of what are the things that I can control, what are the things I can't control. Too often, and frustratingly for me, somebody who's very type A, the list of things I can't control is longer than the list of things that I can control. But if you spend too much time on this ledger, you don't do anything on this ledger, and that's actually the most disempowering thing that you can do. When you have a president that is trying to use the military against the American people, that is not a symbol of somebody who feels like they have a lot of strength in this moment. 7 million people came out on Saturday to protest this administration, the largest single-day protest in American history. In American history. So we should be very clear that we are not alone in this, that a majority of the American people are not okay with what is happening. And we have to hold the fact that we have a lot of strength and power, not only in our numbers, but also in this moment more broadly than it feels like we have. And a part of the way you know that is by some of the ridiculous things that he's doing. things that people only do when there is mass dissent. These are things that autocrats do when they cannot get the population to go along just with the lies that they tell, with their control of the media apparatus. And Republicans do have that. Every major media outlet is controlled and run by a Republican billionaire. Every single one. Even if you want to stop thinking about politics for a second and just play 2K, that's going to be owned by Donald Trump's son. So they have controlled in many ways the means of communication. But even with all of that control, they cannot get a majority of the American people to co-sign rounding up our neighbors who have lived here in many cases for years and decades because they don't have a piece of paper. The majority of American people are not co-signing on that. They can't get us to co-sign on turning against our neighbors in the way that they thought they could. And so there is a reason that whenever the Republicans protest, they have to use violence. And they continually try to paint the Democratic Party or the non-Trump side of the ledger as violent, and they can take down the website, but this is not Malcolm Kenyatta's opinion. These are FBI statistics that far white supremacist extremism, FBI said is the greatest threat to our country and represents most of the violence that we see. When they lost an election, they went and shit on Nancy Pelosi's desk and beat cops. When we lost an election, we organized 7 million of our neighbors to come out and to make it clear what our values are. That's the difference. And frankly, our side of the ledger doing things peacefully, when you look at people who have studied taking on authoritarian governments, peaceful protests it's not even about being weak. Peaceful protests are more successful in the long run than violent protests. And violent protests happen when people don't feel like they have popular ideas. And so the way to win is to try to beat people down, to try to scare people. So you should not be scared in this moment. And in fact, the more he ratchets up the pressure, the more you should feel like we're having a lot of success in this moment. If you look at what they're doing with redistricting right now, it's another example of his fundamental weakness and his fear. Democrats have won or overperformed in 45 of the 46 special elections we've had so far since November, on average by 15 points. So I am confident that the American people are really rising up in ways that matter. But I also think the way that we look at getting out of where we are, we have to invert our thinking. So often as Democrats, and I think a lot of it comes out of the Democratic victories we've had, particularly around civil rights, when states were refusing to protect black folks in this country, we looked to the federal government. There's a lot of big federal legislation that was passed to force states to do it. And so many of you remember the sort of states' rights versus federal rights debate that we've had for a long time. And so what that has meant is Democrats have instinctively looked to the federal government to fix the problems that we're having in the country, while Republicans have methodically and more slowly built local power. I'll give you one example. In this country, we have 3,143 counties, okay? We do not have one big national election where we all get into like a convention center, okay, and vote together, right? We have 3,143 different county-run elections. In 2024, there were 20,000 uncontested races in about 2,000 counties. Of those uncontested races, 80% were uncontested by Republicans. Only 20% were uncontested by Democrats. So what that tells you is that in a majority of this country, there is no local Democrat defending or advancing our values, who is on a local level saying what Democrats believe about public safety, on a local level saying what Democrats believe about investing in our kids and having good, fully funded public schools, talking about what our vision is for housing, for climate resilience, whatever the issue may be, and that really matters. It's asymmetric in a way that I think is really damaging to us, and I think in this moment, the reflex is, we just need a new president. But we didn't get here because we lost one presidential election. We got here because we lost a bunch of county, local, school board, mayoral, gubernatorial elections that Democrats have often put on tier 2. And so a part of how I think we reverse where we are is what we do what Republicans did when they were in the wilderness, so to speak. They went with the support of the Koch brother foundation and so many others. They created these things called victory centers, where they popped up these victory centers in all of these local communities where Democrats had cleaned their clocks and started having conversations with people. Pennsylvania is a prime example of where they had a lot of success, and you can go and look at some maps that will blow your mind of where Democrats used to overperform versus where we perform now. And I'll just give you this one county, Westmoreland County, the largest rural county in western Pennsylvania. Westmoreland County was a Democratic stronghold for generations, okay? Like a Republican even walking in Westmoreland County would be, was far and few in between. After Bill Clinton left the White House, they opened a victory center in Westmoreland County, and somebody who works for me now said she remembers her friends all laughing like, that is so silly, Republicans, why are you wasting your time? You need to be building out more infrastructure in the Philly suburbs where they used to do really well. There is only one countywide elected Democrat in Westmoreland County now. One. And he's only elected because the county charter says that you have to have a minority representation on the ballot. If it was just pure numbers, he wouldn't be elected either. And so even in a crisis as pronounced as the one we're in, we have to be very methodical. If you look at first responders dealing with a forest fire, they're not running all over themselves looking crazy. And it doesn't mean they're not urgent about what we're doing, but they're very methodical and thoughtful. We have to be methodical and thoughtful in recognizing that the challenge we have is a position challenge.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. There's a great organization called Run for Something that can connect you with other people who can help you think about starting to run for office.
I was in their first class of endorsees, by the way, so I love Run for Something.
Yeah, they're awesome. Yeah. So, as we think about, how we build out that 50-state, 3,000-county apparatus, right? We still have these elections looming. And I think that we do need to think about some elements of strategy and how we engage Democratic voters. So, for example, I feel like I get more text messages from Abigail Spanberger, who's running for the governor of Virginia, than I do from my own wife. Maybe I need to talk to my wife about that. But I think that a lot of people feel a little bit overwhelmed by fundraising emails and fundraising text messages, and they don't know where they're coming from and where they go. And I'm curious to know whether there's conversations happening inside and outside the party about how to streamline that apparatus, or like what are the best practices. And I think there's a lot of people in this room wondering, when I get one of these texts, should I give money to this group or which group? I know there's some scandals that have happened about fundraising from external sources. So I'm gonna kick it back over to you to address that question.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, and I will tell you, I get them too, and it's so frustrating and overwhelming. And we're actually, just last week, announced that Act Blue and the Democratic Party have been in ongoing conversations about how to crack down on these spam packs, because the unfortunate thing about my role with the DNC, and I understood this even more when I took this gig, is that any Democrat that does anything, the DNC sort of gets blamed with, right? And so there's an education process that we have to engage with to help people understand what's the difference between the DNC and individual campaigns, frankly, and the difference between the DNC and like the DSCC, for example. The DSCC, that stands for Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. Their entire job is just focused around electing people to the Senate. They do a series of things that has nothing to do with what the DNC is doing. But when they, for example, endorse Janet Mills in Maine, everybody says, the DNC is endorsing Janet Mills. The DNC ain't endorsing nobody. The DNC only endorses our nominees. And we're in a position where, whether it's the text or whether it's endorsements from Democratic-aligned groups, there's an education process that we have to engage in. But I do want to go back to the text to make this point. that when you give to the DNC or when you sign up for a DNC like Democrats.org, anything, we never sell your phone number, give away your email list. We don't do it to campaigns. Even if we send out an email supporting a campaign, we do not give your information to that campaign. A part of the challenge we have is one where, again, those 400 billionaires who I mentioned, that mining your data and using your information that you give in completely non-political contexts. So when campaigns buy lists, which is what you hear a lot, they buy lists of names and phone numbers, email addresses. That is the lifeblood of campaigns at this point, when more and more campaigns are depending on small dollar donations. They get those names and numbers from a variety of different sources. Sometimes campaigns can say, I have names, I'm gonna sell them to you. You're gonna sell names to me. And so they get them that way. But a lot of times they get them from institutions and organizations that spend all day mining your data. So you sign up for a Macy's, Macy's coupon. Now Macy's has your information. And those little cookies, Macy's can sell your information to advertisers and to others. Advertisers, can very easily then look at the public voter registration data and say, you are a Democrat. You like buying sundresses. From that, I can make an inference about the types of candidates that you would be likely to support, and I can now sell that to a campaign, make a lot of money doing it, and flood us with a bunch of text messages from random people. And Act Blue, as the biggest processor of Democratic donations, has a real responsibility to step up and has some capacity in this moment to crack down on some of these PACs which raise money to do, I don't know what the hell they're doing. They don't do anything, so we need to crack down on those, but also crack down on the amount of text messages that individual campaigns can send, on the amount of emails that campaigns can send. On the side of the ledger that I mentioned of what I can control and what Democrats can control, I am very proud to say that a majority of emails you get from the Democratic Party are not fundraising asks. For the first time since the Democrats have been using data in this way. And it's because you have an entirely new leadership team, including me, who was upset about the damn text messages. And so we went in and we're like, we should be sending less. And so we only send 28 to 30% text messages asking, or text messages, emails asking for money. The large majority of emails that you get from the Democratic Party are asking you to volunteer, asking you to make phone calls, asking you to get engaged in some way, and including some emails asking you to go to the protests on Saturday.
Well, it seems like those worked because the turnout at the protests was tremendous. So that was so great to see. I'm going to throw one more question before we turn it over to the audience here. And that is really, I think, a bigger picture question about where we are as a country right now. When you look at what's happening, with ICE, with the Supreme Court, with the gerrymandering, with all of the sort of abuses of executive power that you're seeing coming out of the White House, I think like a young person who's just starting to pay attention to politics, just turned 18 or something, and thinking like, my God, like what is going on out there? Like, is the United States still a democracy at this moment? And if not, what do we do? What do we do about that?
We are certainly in an authoritarian takeover of our democracy. I think there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But let me also say, I've been very much comforted by history. One of the tried and true tactics of authoritarians is this thing called historical revisionism. Okay? There's a reason that they're doing another whole congressional panel about January 6th to try to make us forget about the guy who shit on Nancy Pelosi's desk, the cops that they killed, the hang Mike Pence chants, and all of that. There's a reason that they do that. Before, in other eras of time, people would take books and put them in the city square and light them on fire. Now they delete websites and try to take down historically significant displays in our museums and in our national parks, on and on and on. A part of why they do that is to make us, A, forget the things that they have done that are really embarrassing to them, frankly, but also to make us forget who the hell we are. You know, if you've ever read the book or watched the TV show, why am I blanking on the name? Handmaid's Tale. One of the things that's so depressing about that is the author said, she said, I didn't put anything in the show or in the book that had not already happened. That had not already happened in human history. Humans have had a great capacity to harm each other and to treat our neighbors as strangers and to treat each other like crap when given a monicum of authority to advance those hateful anti-neighbor views. We've done that. But we've also had a great capacity as humans and as Americans to come together in ways that really matter. And I think that if we're going to be inspired by history, inspired by the civil rights movement, we need to have a real understanding of what actually happened. Because if you want to tell a long story, a part of the way that you do it is you make it about a couple of central characters, right? That's the way you tell a long story. And that has actually been to our detriment in our view. Because we've told my generation the story of the civil rights movement and made it about one lady who sat on a bus. They said no. We made it about one guy who gave a big speech at one rally one day. He had this big dream. And then Malcolm X said, get your hand out of my pocket once. And then, boom, civil rights. The civil rights movement was much more messy than that. They sat in rooms just like this saying, like, what the hell are we doing? We don't have enough of a coordinated strategy. Like, you're saying this, you're saying this. That complexity should actually give us a lot of confidence that, like, the confusion we have, the anger we have, sometimes the lack of enthusiasm we have about getting up and doing it again, facing another day with all of this nonsense. Anybody who you can think of, who you have been inspired by, has had those exact same series of events. Has woken up like, what the hell am I gonna do? Has looked around and said, maybe what I'm doing isn't working. You never know if what you're doing works until it works. I think about this often. 60 years ago, historic march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You all know about this. And everybody knows about John Lewis and can quote John Lewis saying, get into good trouble. And so I think in this moment, I hear a lot of people saying, well, who's going to be the next John Lewis? And they completely misunderstand history. John Lewis didn't know he was going to be the John Lewis that we know. When they showed up to that bridge that day, 60 years ago, polling for civil rights was at 19%. 19%. A majority of black folks said that the protests were making it less likely that we were going to get the types of civil rights changes that we got in that legislation. There was a very popular governor who had won an election, who armed state troopers and military-grade equipment, put them at the end of the bridge, told the marchers they better not march across the bridge or they were going to be hit with water hoses and batons and bitten by dogs and arrested. Does that sound familiar to kind of what's happening right now? And so in this moment, everybody wants to just jump to the end of the story, where they got off the bridge, John Lewis was a hero, and civil rights was passed. But in this moment, if you are waiting to figure out who's going to be the hero of the moment, who's going to be the person who we quote years later, if you're waiting for that, you're going to be waiting for a long time. Just get on the damn bridge. Like 600 people did, most of whose names we don't remember. But they got on the bridge because they believed there is something worth fighting for. I think it is worth fighting for a country where every single person can go to the damn doctor when they're sick and afford the prescription when they leave the appointment. If you believe that, get on the bridge. I believe that in this country, no matter who you are, what you look like, who you love, how you worship, how you identify, you ought not be treated like shit by your government. If you believe that, then get on the damn bridge in this moment. And the same is true about voting rights, about not having an authority. Get on the damn bridge. Do what you can do with the tools that you have. You do not have to solve all of the world's problems. You have to do something where you are. And if you're waiting for somebody to solve all the world's problems, you have missed the lesson of how we've ever solved anything. The civil rights movement was successful because there were a bunch of people who were getting in good trouble where they lived. A bunch of people whose names you do not know, who were integrating schools, who were sitting at lunch counters they weren't supposed to sit at, who were running for office, who were getting engaged in nonviolent protests. And all we can remember are the highlights. But the truth of it was much more complicated, much more patchwork. And that is the truth of what this moment is going to mean for us. There will never be a PowerPoint slide where we're all going to come together in rooms like this and say, okay, well, we did number 1. Okay, now let's do number 2. It's always going to be us, each of us, doing 1,000 different things. I decided that one of the things I could do was go and try to change the Democratic Party and run and be the youngest person to ever be a part of our leadership team ever, of any major national party ever. That's what I could do. It's one of the things that I could do. What you may do is leave Roosevelt University and go and run for office. What you may do is go support a campaign while you're a student. What you may do is see an ICE agent that is trying to abscond one of your neighbors, start recording, calling them out, as I've seen Chicagoans doing all across. People have been beeping their horns, chasing them down the street, making their lives very uncomfortable. If they want to make our lives miserable, then we can nonviolently make their lives miserable, and then we can go out and vote like our lives depend on it, get on the damn bridge, and do what every generation has had to do. We are no exception. We are no exception. Every generation has looked to the previous generation and says, how the hell did you let it get this bad? Every generation has done that. Now it's our turn. And once and let me be very clear on this and I'll end here. We will outlast this moment. We will outlast this moment. The American story does not end with a chapter about a Timu dictator with swollen ankles and a Twitter problem. That's not where the country ends, I promise you. But when we are in a position to lead, when we do run for something and take over, Gen Alpha is coming right now saying, Gen Z, you're not doing enough, okay? So I promise you. But that is the positive thing about our system. Every generation, rightfully, pushes us to do more, to do it faster, to work more aggressively, to meet needs and concerns that we hadn't envisioned before. That is the power, the promise, and the frustration of living in a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-ethnic democracy. But that's also what it costs. Democracy requires something, and it's going to require something of our nation too. So thank you so much, and thank you for your incredible questions.
Do we have a method to have somebody ask a question? We don't have time for too many, but maybe 1 or 2. Yeah, okay. Does anybody would like to ask a question of Representative Kenyatta? Just ask you to be concise in your questioning.
And can you please
Given
tell me your
time.
name too? I'm sorry.
My name's Patrick Brooks. To keep my question as concise as possible and to reveal a little bit about myself, I've actually been a campaign manager for a couple of races for the Democratic Party. So forgive me if this is something that's come up in a lot of meetings. In the last 20 years, especially like being a Democrat myself in a very Republican household, I see 2 parties competing over the same set of middle American voters. And I see some Democrats make a misstep and kind of give Republicans control over the narrative and how they compete over those sort of center Americans. And so what I want to know more as a strategy answer for what the Dems are going to do, how do you plan on dealing with the fact that the Republicans have made their whole existence playing on people's fears, as opposed to the Democrats who are sort of being a little kosher and a little relaxed about where we have gotten in this environment?
One of the things Republicans have done well is to identify a villain. They've gotten the villains wrong. They've made the villains our neighbors. They've made the villains trans athletes. There are less NCAA trans athletes than Donald Trump has felonies, okay? But we've spent more time talking about the trans athletes than we have about the fact that there's a felon who's in the White House right now building a ballroom while people can't afford to eat. So I think we have to be very clear on who the villain is. And to me, I think it is villainous. I think it is shameful. I think it is sinful that 400 people have more wealth than 50% of the country combined. And us not talking about that every single day is a problem. The fact that we have not spent enough time talking about the corruption of this administration is a problem. And I've heard so many people say, well, just talk about the economy. It's the economy, stupid. I think James is wrong on a lot of things. He's right on that point. But talking about corruption actually is an economic message. A part of the reason we're seeing inflation rise and we're seeing the impact of tariffs on everything from the cost of food to the ability to build and buy a new home is driven out of this president using tariffs to benefit a corrupt set of individuals that fund him. If you look at just the other day when he announced new tariffs or the possibility of new tariffs on China, somebody within his administration went and shorted Bitcoin to the tune of $192 million that they made in 20 minutes because they had prior knowledge of the tweet that he was going to send out about those tariffs. That's a problem. And it's a problem for all of us. So a lot of times, what Donald Trump has done and what he's done very effectively is to flood the zone, right? It's easier for people to, in their mind's eye, understand one person mugging somebody on the street than it is to understand the constant criminality that's in it. Because to tell a story about the criminality, I mean, literally, we could have just done things where you just asked me about which crimes has Donald Trump committed today. That's an hour. So they've been very good about that. I think the strategy and approach to winning those voters, though, I think is a bit of a separate question. And it's not necessarily about fear. It's about authenticity. One of the things that I will never shake is I was on, so I ran for Senate against John Fetterman in 2022. I was in LA and doing one of the Pod Save America, whatever. And they had just wrapped up a focus group. And there was a woman who's a Democratic voter who I think just stayed home in the 2016 election, who said that she didn't know, what she wanted to do because Donald Trump was a liar, but he was the most honest liar she knew. And I think that, that sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually not at all. I think what people are frustrated by is that too many believe the way to win support is by being anything you seem like you want me to be. That's not been my approach. I have said early on in my career, and it's the only promise I made to myself. I owe you a lot as people who may or may not be in the Democratic Party, as people who might be independents. I hope you join the Democratic Party. But even my neighbors who give me the opportunity to be their representatives, I owe them a lot. What I don't owe them is sun salutations, to do a downward-facing dog, to put myself in a pretzel and be somebody I'm not. I don't owe you that. What I owe you is to tell you exactly what I think on all of the complicated issues, and then trust you to make a decision about whether or not you want to support me based on those things. And you will find that people are smart enough to understand, and I think all of you in this room understand, that there is not a person who's run for anything who you agree with on every single thing, who sent out every single tweet that you would have sent out. Sometimes you look at tweets you sent out and you wouldn't have sent them out again, okay? So the idea that we somehow are going to grow in a lab the perfect candidate is wrong. And we have harmed ourselves by limiting the types of candidates to lead and be the faces of our party because we don't think they fit into a petri dish. When I ran against John Fetterman, I had so many people who would say to me constantly, Malcolm, well, I support you 100%. You're saying everything that I want, but I think some white person in some other town's not gonna like you. I'm like, you've never even been to that town. You know nobody from that town, and you're telling me how they're going to vote, and then you're going to keep your vote from me, the thing that could actually make me be successful, because you are playing 19-dimensional chess. I think when we think about this presidential primary, right, that's going to come up that we'll all be focused on, don't get involved in that nonsense of, well, the poll says this person can win in November, that person can win in November. The candidates who can win are the ones who you're willing to support. The ones who you're willing to go and knock on doors for in Illinois when it's cold as hell. The ones who you're willing to make phone calls for when you're tired and you've just finished doing a lot of homework. The ones who you're willing to battle with on TikTok, talking to your friends about why you support this candidate. Those candidates are the candidates that can be successful. And so I think we need to be seeking out candidates who drip with authenticity and with a sense of who they are and what they believe.
Well, I feel better than when I walked in the room this morning, so I hope you all feel the same way, and please join me again in thanking